Viv, you and I both had experiences going to Assagioli's house in Florence, which is a bit like visiting this sort of house, similar sort of size, a bit bigger. You see the study, you see all the relics, you see the books and all that. And I think Assagioli seems to be held in sort of hallowed space, same as Freud did, but he was far less known because he wasn't particularly a self-publicist. No. And some of the people in the room might be wondering, well, what was the connection? And I pulled something just very obvious from Wiki, the great font of knowledge on the web. I'll just read it out, and it may help those of you who have not yet done psychosynthesis understand the relationship. Freud and Assagioli were known to have corresponded, although they never had the chance to meet. Assagioli said, psychosynthesis presupposes psychoanalysis, or rather includes it as a first and necessary stage. I'll repeat that. Psychosynthesis presupposes psychoanalysis, or rather includes it as a first and necessary stage. However, Assagioli disagreed with theories formulated by Sigmund Freud that he considered rather limiting. He refused to accept Freud's reductionism and the neglect of the positive dimensions of the personality. Psychosynthesis became the first approach born of psychoanalysis that also included the artistic, altruistic and heroic potentials of the human being. Assagioli's work was more in alignment with psychologist Carl Jung. Both Assagioli and Jung validated the importance of the spiritual level of human existence. Assagioli shared with Jung the insight that psychological symptoms can be triggered by spiritual dynamics. Assagioli considered Jung's theories to be closest to his understanding of psychosynthesis. Now, when we go around the house here and we see all these ancient relics and the study and everything, well, Freud was also spiritual in his own way, wasn't he?
Yes, and none of this is rehearsed, by the way. I've just we except that I knew that Keith was going to start with this quote. Yeah, when I went to visit his house in Vienna, having been quite prejudiced against Jung. Sorry, not Jung. That's a Freudian slip, actually, because I'm going to go on to that. That's a Freudian slip. Okay, having been quite turned off by Freud, as we were in the 70s, right, when therapy was kind of going a bit wild in those days, I was deeply, profoundly struck by the atmosphere in Freud's study, in his home. And as I looked round, just as looking round here at the artifacts, I thought, this man has got a soul. There is something here. And he had certain values of family that were really, really important, and his connection with childhood as well. So I've written a few things up later about reasons to be cheerful about Freud, because we're probably going to be looking at all the differences and the way that Assagioli and Jung, of course, included the transpersonal, which initially Freud, who desperately wanted to be accepted as a scientist, he desperately wanted psychoanalysis to be kosher. Yeah, it had to be acceptable, and he fought for that, and he pushed himself on that, and to such an extent that he was worried about anything that could undermine that, and that would include the whole spiritual realm. But that doesn't mean that secretly inside he didn't have a sense of the spiritual.
Can I say something here?
Yeah.
See, one of the problems, just like people say Marx wasn't a Marxist, I think Freud, I don't know if he actually said it, I'm not a Freudian, I think a lot of the damage to Freud has been done by the Freudians that came after, that took it all terribly seriously and wanted, did the reductionism into just horrible childhoods, you know. Yeah. Which the sort of legacy we associate with Freud and Klein and people like that now.
Yeah. So in fact it's the distortions that happen and the rigidities that happen around
Well, I'm wondering, I don't know.
Well, Bleuler, who set up with Jung the Bergholtzy Centre in 1908, the first therapeutic centre, but he was an associate of Freud, and he was also moving away from his ideas, but he did say that there was a tendency in Freud to rather like a dog with a bone, although that's not a quote from him, to keep on pushing his ideas and, if you like, marketing himself, which caused the split, which is why Bleuler, although he was polite to Freud in the letter, this is all coming from Jean Hardy's book, Psychology with a Soul.
30 years ago this was written, and it's still current state.
Yeah.
Brilliant book, read it.
Well, 1987 was when I had this book, and I was in the first study group. I trained with Jean, so Jean was my colleague, and so yes, it's 30 years old, 87. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, read it. It says a lot. But just to finish your point, is that there was a split, and Jung moved away, Bleuler moved away from Freud's thinking because of his apparent rigidity and his tenacious, this is what I'm trying to prove.
Okay. Do you think Freud was rigid because he was such a pioneer, and he was really trying to get the whole idea of basically the unconscious and, all the projective stuff from childhood really onto the roadmap, that he had to be quite rigid at the beginning, being the originator?
Yes, and he wasn't taken much into account before 1900, and things were, well, 1895 his book on dreams came out. I think it was 95. I'm not a Freudian, so I don't know, others might
She's
know
not
better.
afraid of talking about it.
I'm not a Freudian. Yeah. But that was an important step, but he was still ignored at last. And I do think about, well, as a Jew, we're both Jewish, we happen to have a lot of Jewish people in the profession. I do wonder about the climate at the time in Vienna.
Even as late as the mid-1930s, I can't quote the book, but there's a story of Freud giving a talk to a number of scientists about the unconscious in the early 1930s in Vienna. And somebody apparently stood up at the meeting and said, "This is not a matter of science, this is a matter for the police."
Yeah.
Even as late as the 30s, the idea of the unconscious was radical.
Yeah. So he did. He gained respect, but you're probably right. He probably was rigid and firm with it because he had to prove something and to get through. Actually, maybe this is a time just to kind of. I'll show you what I've just put down. And then we talk about the ways that Assagioli and Jung, of course, first moved away from his thinking. But so, if you can't see it, don't worry. You said you weren't able to. So reasons to be cheerful about Freud, and not being a Freudian, I kind of thought about the different things that come from him and the whole study of psychoanalysis. And of course, before 1900, in the late 1890s, there were lots of other influences, and madness was treated, hysterics. There was a lot of hypnotherapy, mesmerism, but the patient was considered sick in many ways. Now, he made a link to childhood and the significance of childhood on behaviour, and he was the first person to really kind of push that. I'm not saying he was the first person to think that, but he certainly pushed that. He also, which was quite surprising, made the links with body, mind and feelings. He was the first person that really made a connection with body and mind, how the mind impacts, of course, like hysteria, which was, you know, traditionally a female condition, but you know, and the hyster, the womb, but he also looked at how he used himself in experimentation, as Jung did too, which is another one of these points. He was willing, number 4, he was willing to use himself. So he also looked at when he was stressed, when he developed headaches, you know, so he did make that body-mind feelings connection, and that was important. And with it, the repression, when you repress certain emotions, what happens in your body, what can happen. And he's, as a medical doctor, he saw many people with symptoms, you know, from boils to rashes. So somatization was found in his early work, which was also the starting point, interestingly, for Assagioli's work, somatization. Because psychosynthesis, as some of you might know, and it's not mentioned in Jean's book, that's because she was a little bit, bless her, disconnected from her body, but she was very, very good mind, was the first term for psychosynthesis was biopsychosynthesis, right? The body, coming from the body, and psychosynthesis, as you know, Assagioli did develop psychosynthesis as a tenet, a part of bio.
He didn't write very much about it, did he?
He did. He wrote about energy, and he wrote about well, he did actually, but he wrote about body and movement, but he didn't embody it as much. That's the thing. You see, these people are great thinkers, but don't always embody it.
Just to clarify, when you say didn't embody it, just because you went back and forth there, what do you mean?
Sorry?
How did he not embody it?
How did he not embody it?
Biopsychosynthesis.
Well, I haven't yet found out whether he did things like dance and movement and yoga, but he had an energy. He had a wonderful energy. So in a way, yes, he did embody it. So maybe he actually didn't write about a lot of things, did he?
Well, no, most of his writing is you know, ploughing through his stuff.
Yeah.
It's all about spirit and psyche and society.
Yeah.
A great person around
Yeah.
society. I didn't find very much at all that he wrote about the body.
No.
But did he not practice 2 different kinds of yoga for a long,
He might have.
time?
He might have, I don't know. He certainly researched it. We found that out at the causal. I just want to go back to, because we'll talk about Roberto. So yes, you're probably right. He, you know, so Freud also considered different parts of the personality, but he saw them more as fragmentation and problematic, and that basically you had to help the patient, as he called them, integrate these different parts. Assagioli saw the different parts as things to be understood that were important in their own right, had a core okayness to them, and you know, subpersonalities. And in dialogue in a letter, apparently Freud was said quite irritably something. I think I have the quote. What was it? And it's from. It was something around. Well, actually, I probably won't be able to find it. Well, psychoanalysis and psychosynthesis are in the same vein, because I'm going to work towards healing the different parts or integrating them. But he was quite irritable. I'll find the quote later. I think, so he was a bit irritated by Assagioli's emphasis on the positive, or the going back to the core before it became distorted. And that was one of the major splits. So the other good thing was that his work on the unconscious, the major point, you know, that whether he discovered the unconscious, he certainly marketed it. That was his thing, the unconscious, and he did it by his book on dreams, his use of free association, which of course we use in psychosynthesis and you know, visualizations, free drawing, all of that. And he was really involved with trying to make it a scientific research, not a matter for the police, but yeah. And we use all these things, free association. If you read the rules or the guidelines by Freud on free association, they're incredibly modern, actually. They are really modern. Like, you know, just let anything come to mind, don't censor, just the sort of things we say when we're working with a client now, you know, just see whatever comes up. And of course, yes, his work with dreams and symbols. There was a quote by Bettelheim in his book. Again, I'm not sure what that was, but the book, in this book, and Jean Hardy quotes it, Bettelheim makes a case for Jung not being anti-soul, but he was actually, he
Jung
might...
Freud.
Oh, I keep saying Jung. I keep saying Jung, sorry, because I've been reading a lot about Jung as well.
There's a spirit of Freud in the house.
Freud. There is. It's for Freud, not being anti-soul, but in the early days of his publicisation, he would decry, he would say things against religion and that religion's being a prop. So that's, I've got quotes and stuff, but anyway, so that's what I wanted to.
Can I point out something in that about the importance of childhood? See, one of the splits within the Jungians, and still today, is how much importance to give to childhood. Because certain Jungians, some of you will have heard of people like James Hillman, thought we paid too much attention to childhood. It's like, okay, a lot of the repressions, a lot of the splits occur in childhood, but in terms of the life of the unconscious, whether it's what we call the superconscious or the lower unconscious, too much emphasis is put on childhood rather than the more universal sort of age-free idea of the unconscious. And it may be, I don't know whether it was Anna Freud that took everything, you know, back to childhood. I mean, certainly it's flavour of everything today, but a lot of the Jungians split over the issue of how much importance to give to child development, you know. And Assagioli didn't really do much about childhood.
He didn't have a model of child development.
No, Assagioli was quite adult, I think. Was quite sort of.
Well, didn't Assagioli say that psychosynthesis, as well as being a way of looking at life, was development that you could do post-analysis? That's he actually said, when you've done your analysis, then you can do psychosynthesis, because then you're on the journey to integrating towards the transpersonal. You've really done your personality work. Yeah, and the wonderful thing about Roberto Assagioli was that he developed all these techniques for accessing transpersonal realms of the unconscious, all the good, which Jung didn't really. He didn't. Oh, I keep saying Jung. You see, in my head, I'm doing a talk about Jung, because there are certain ways that Jung and Freud completely disagreed, and as you know, and where that took Jung, and with him Freud, no, with him Assagioli. Right, I'm getting very muddled. Sorry. So that's the difference with Roberto's exercises, I think, that he. But as for childhood, yeah, I think the whole field of analysis, psychoanalysis, does. Well, I'll ask you a question. When you think about clients that come into our therapy rooms, and some of them are looking at existential stuff, they're troubled by the times today.
Okay.
All right, they're troubled by what's going to happen in the world. They feel powerless. Sometimes it's not just because, you know, mummy or daddy did this to me when I was young. So they're bringing in really important existential issues of how can I make a difference, you know, meaning, what's my role, and my powerlessness, all of that. What, do you know anything around Freud's attitudes to that, the more existential kind of?
I don't actually, but I'd like to put the question in a slightly different way. About the way we consider childhood, or the way Freud considered childhood causal in what goes on in adulthood. Now, here's a conundrum. Earlier this year, I was in Bilbao to go to the Guggenheim Museum, designed by Frank Gehry. And has anyone been there? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. The building is covered in sort of titanium, aluminium scales, very, very thin. It makes the building look very fish-like. If you read about the building, people say, the reason Gehry had this fish scaly sort of surface to the building was when he was young, he used to accompany his grandma to the local fish market, and he was absolutely fixated by fish. He absolutely was obsessed by fish. Now, you could look at it from one point of view and say that's the origin of his interest in wanting to make the building look like a scaly fish. Or you could say there's something inherent to Gehry that preceded childhood. Some people might say it's the spirit of his past life, whatever, which made him attracted as a child to fish. Now, we're none of us are born blank slates. You know, do we come into this world already as a fully formed soul, with a sort of history, if you like, or is that history entirely created through the sort of neuroses and complexes and parental upbringing that we receive from the day we're born? See, and I don't think we can ever resolve that, but I think the danger is to make childhood totally causal. Now, what I don't know about Freud is whether he felt childhood was totally causal in creating adult angst, adult existential angst, or whether it was just one factor in creating the adult self.
Because he didn't, Jung said, I'm consciously saying Jung this time, Jung definitely had the idea of the collective unconscious and the impact of the collective unconscious, which Assagioli also, you know, the broken lines on the 8 diagram, was very aware of. And I don't know, and I don't know if anyone else here knows, has anyone...
Let's open it up.
Yeah, let's open it up.
We'll open it up now.
Well, does anyone else know about Freud's... well, I know he didn't have much hope for the future of mankind, and that's another difference. He was quite a pessimist.
Assagioli was more of an optimist, I think.
Assagioli was an optimist, and they say that Jung was more balanced, you know, the yin-yang, the light and the dark. But Freud didn't hold out much hope, so he's got all sorts of ideas around evil being basic and intrinsic to our instinctual drives, whereas Assagioli really looked at the essential good.
While we're saying that, before we open it up, there is, I think, a very important difference between Assagioli on one side and Freud and Jung on the other, which was Assagioli attached great importance to the will to change.
Absolutely, that
and
was
this
his
is Assagioli's great strength and great differential from Jung.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to know, explore that in depth, do read an issue of the Journal for Transpersonal Psychology, I think March this year, where there's Massimo Rosselli has written a very, very good piece comparing Assagioli and Jung. And Assagioli believed really that if you a bit like Marx in a way, that philosophers study the world, but the object is to change it. And I think Assagioli was much more change and development oriented, whereas Jung and Freud were more about just let's explore, and you see, and I think that probably gives rise to Freud's pessimism and Assagioli's optimism.
Absolutely, because he putting the will into it and developing the exercises. I mean, one of the most inspiring comments that or statements that came way back that impacted on me when I first came into the training, and that's a long time ago, was I think it was Diana then, probably around 1980, 81, talking about how Assagioli was working in the hospital with Jung and Freuds, and what he noticed was that no matter how damaged someone was, and how fragmented they appeared, how broken, he sort of got a sense of a nugget of something, a seed of something okay in them, and that's what he built his work on. You know, that was his experience of like a window into them.
Did Freud have that window? Or
no,
not?
Freud
Okay.
didn't. No, as far as I know.
That's an important distinction.
It's a huge distinction, but it's not been written about in that way. It impacted on me hugely, and because I was working with kids in a school, very damaged kids, I had no idea of being no concept or vision of being a therapist. I was doing it as in the old days. The trust was education, so I was bringing psychosynthesis into education, and it was really, no matter how damaged, that comment that Diana made about him was, there is always something, and you know, if a child gets labelled a problem and comes into your class as a teacher, do you see him as a problem? Freud would have, but do you see him as his potential?
So let's introduce a word that you and I haven't used yet, which is the possibility for transformation. Now, Assagioli was big on transformation. He went with that fourth force in psychology, you know, the spiritual transformation force, that transformation was possible. Would you say Freud didn't hold that view?
I think he thought it was more dependent on him and the work, and less on the instincts of the patient, whereas Assagioli, and to some extent Jung, trusted that there was something in the client that knew, something that, you know, that knows. And in fact, Assagioli's work with the unconscious was to trust it, that it isn't all, you know, id stuff. It's not all the awful stuff. That in the unconscious, and allowing it to speak and trusting it will become the potential.
So you're
of
saying
wisdom.
really that Freud created dependency?
Yes, possibly.
And now psychosynthesis holds a very different view of dependency. That dependency is only part of the process, but our objective is that people take back their dependency and become their own person and in charge of their own
Which
growth.
is why transference and countertransference in psychosynthesis terms is not central to the work. It comes and is used as and when it.
Whereas in psychoanalysis, classical psychoanalysis, it is central. It's really important.
It's very important difference.
Shall we open it up?
Yes, and if anyone knows that question around Freud and his relation to the world and the atmosphere of, I'm sure that coloured, you know, the threat in Nazi Vienna and Germany at the time did colour his views on humanity, obviously, even in his dreams.
Well, Assagioli himself got imprisoned at one stage, but it didn't make him a pessimist.
No, that's true. And in fact, he transformed the...
He did.
He
did Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, he did. He transformed his experience, but it was only a month. But it was still...
He wrote a lot in that month.
He did.
Wrote a lot in
He
that
devised
month.
a lot of his exercises.
Anyway, let's open it
okay.
up.